It is June 9th, 2001. The Pepsi Center in Denver is shaking. Not swaying, not rocking, shaking. 19,000 people are on their feet, and the noise has reached the point where sound becomes something physical, something you feel in your sternum. The Colorado Avalanche have just beaten the New Jersey Devils in Game 7 to win the Stanley Cup, and the ice is a mess of gloves, sticks, and grown men weeping. The commissioner walks out with the trophy. The cameras tighten, and then something happens that will live longer than the game itself, longer than the season, longer perhaps than any single gesture in the history of professional hockey. Joe Sakic receives the Stanley Cup. He lifts it, not over his head, not into the air with the triumphant roar of a man who has waited his whole life for this. He lifts it just enough to carry it, and then he does something no captain in memory had ever done. He skates it directly to Ray Bourque, a 40-year-old defenseman who had played 22 seasons without ever winning a championship, a man who had come to Colorado for one final chance at the only thing missing from a perfect career. Sakic does not hesitate. He does not take his lap. He does not soak in the moment that belongs to him as the captain who built this team, who bled for this franchise through the years in Quebec when no one was watching, who carried this roster on a wrist shot that goalies described as unhittable. He hands the cup to someone else, and the arena, already loud, reaches a register of sound that witnesses would later say they had never heard before and never heard again. That is who Joe Sakic was. Not the loudest, not the flashiest, not the one who demanded the spotlight. He was the one who, in the single greatest moment of his professional life, thought of someone else first. And if you think that gesture was soft, if you think quiet means gentle, then you do not know this story. Because Sakic was one of the most lethal offensive players in the history of the National Hockey League, a man who scored 625 goals with a release so fast that goaltenders admitted they never saw the puck leave his blade. He captained one of the most dominant teams of the 1990s and 2000s. He won 2 Stanley Cups, a Hart Trophy, a Conn Smythe Trophy, and an Olympic gold medal. He did all of it with a demeanor so calm that teammates sometimes wondered if his pulse ever rose above resting. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand why the quietest captain in hockey history might also have been the most complete. Before we get started, if you find these stories as moving as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more people who appreciate the legends of the game. Now, let's begin. There is no trophy in professional sports quite like the Stanley Cup. Not the Lombardi Trophy, which is manufactured new each year and handed to a franchise that may not remember it a decade later. Not the Larry O'Brien Championship Trophy, which gleams on a shelf and gathers dust in a glass case. The Stanley Cup is different. It is alive. It carries the weight of every name ever engraved on its silver bands. And those names do not fade. They travel. The cup goes home with every player on the winning roster, to their hometowns, to their kitchen tables, to hospitals and hockey rinks, and places where children line up just to touch it. It has been to the bottom of a swimming pool. It has been left on the side of a road in Montreal after a celebration that went too far. It has been to war zones and orphanages and small towns in Saskatchewan, where the nearest NHL arena is a 6-hour drive away. The Stanley Cup is not just a trophy. It is the shared memory of a sport, and the pursuit of it has broken more men than it has crowned. Consider the mathematics. 32 teams compete each season. Only one lifts the cup. A career in professional hockey averages, generously, somewhere between 12 and 15 years for the elite. Many of the greatest players who ever lived. Marcel Dion, who scored 731 goals and never won a championship. Gilbert Perreault, whose skating was described as poetry and whose ring finger remained bare, retired without ever touching the thing. The Stanley Cup does not care about talent. It does not care about regular season records or individual awards. It demands something more, something harder to define, a combination of skill, will, durability, and the particular cruelty of a playoff format that requires 16 victories across 4 rounds, often against opponents who are willing to break bones and shatter teeth to stop you. The cup was first awarded in 1893, donated by Lord Stanley of Preston, the Governor-General of Canada, who paid roughly $50 for it, a sum that even in that era was modest. He intended it for the best amateur hockey club in Canada. Within a decade, professional teams were fighting for it. By 1917, when the National Hockey League was founded in a hotel room in Montreal, by men who could barely tolerate each other, the Cup had already survived challenge matches, disputed claims, and at least one occasion where a team reportedly tried to steal it overnight. The trophy predates the league itself. It does not belong to the NHL. The NHL merely holds it in trust, and there are times when the Cup seems to remind the league of that distinction. For decades, winning it was the domain of a select few. The Montreal Canadiens won 24 championships, a number so staggering that it warps the entire history of the sport. The Toronto Maple Leafs won 13, though their last came in 1967, a drought so long it has become its own kind of legend. The Detroit Red Wings, the Boston Bruins, the Chicago Blackhawks, these original 6 franchises treated the Cup as a family heirloom, passing it among themselves in an era when the league had only 6 teams, and the talent pool was concentrated to a degree that made dominance possible and dynasties inevitable. Then expansion came. In 1967, the NHL doubled from 6 teams to 12 overnight, and the balance of power shifted. New franchises in cities like Philadelphia, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles brought new markets, new fans, and eventually new dynasties. The Philadelphia Flyers won back-to-back cups in 1974 and 75, with a style so physical it earned them the nickname the Broad Street Bullies. The New York Islanders won 4 straight from 1980 to 83, a run of sustained excellence that remains one of the most impressive in league history. And then Edmonton arrived. Wayne Gretzky, Mark Messier, Paul Coffey, Grant Fuhr, and the Oilers won 5 cups in 7 years, with a brand of hockey so fast and so beautiful that it redefined what the sport could be. But by the early 1990s, something had changed. The game had slowed. The neutral zone trap, a defensive system that clogged the middle of the ice and strangled offensive creativity, had taken hold. Scoring dropped. Games became grinding affairs of attrition. The Pittsburgh Penguins, led by Mario Lemieux, won back-to-back cups in 1991 and 92, and it felt like the last gasp of wide-open artistry. After that, the league entered an era where the cup was won not by the most talented team, but by the most relentless one. It was into this landscape that the Quebec Nordiques relocated to Denver, Colorado in 1995. They brought with them a roster full of young talent, a history of heartbreak, and a captain who had been leading that franchise since he was 22 years old. His name was Joe Sakic. He had never won a playoff series as captain of the Nordiques. He had spent years playing in front of crowds so sparse that you could hear individual voices from the stands. He had been overlooked in award voting, undervalued in the broader hockey conversation, and overshadowed by the louder, more charismatic stars of his era. And now he was in a new city, with a new name on the jersey, and the same old question hanging over him: could he win when it mattered? The Stanley Cup has a way of sorting men into 2 categories. There are those who chase it and never catch it, whose careers are defined by the absence of that single triumph. And there are those who seize it, not just once, but in a way that leaves a permanent mark on the trophy and the sport. The names engraved on the cup tell you who won, but the way they won, the suffering that preceded the celebration, the years of doubt that preceded the certainty, that is the story the silver does not show. Joe Sakic's name is on the cup twice, once in 1996, once in 2001, but the journey to those engravings is a story of patience, pain, and a particular kind of leadership that the sport had rarely seen. The leadership of a man who led not by shouting but by showing, not by demanding but by delivering, and not by claiming the spotlight but by directing it toward others. The cup remembers him. The question is whether the rest of us remember him well enough. The tradition of the captain's relationship with the Stanley Cup is one of the most sacred rituals in professional sports. The captain lifts it first. The captain decides who receives it next. That order, that unspoken hierarchy of respect and debt, tells you everything about who that captain is and what they value. Some captains take a long, slow lap. Some captains weep openly. Some captains scream into the arena like men released from prison. Joe Sakic, when he won his first cup in 1996, lifted it with the quiet intensity of a man who had always known this moment would come and had simply been waiting for the world to catch up. When he won his second, he gave it away. Both choices reveal the same man. Both choices reveal a captain who understood something fundamental about the trophy he held, that it does not belong to any one person. It belongs to every hand that carried the team to it, and it is through this lens, the lens of the cup itself, the oldest trophy in North American professional sports, the 35 pounds of silver and nickel that have been carried through the streets of 100 cities, that the story of Joe Sakic finds its truest shape. Because Sakic was never the kind of player who announced his greatness. He was the kind of player whose greatness announced itself only when you looked at the cup and saw his name, his fingerprints, his legacy embedded in the metal. Joseph Stephen Sakic was born on the 7th of July 1969 in Burnaby, British Columbia, a suburb of Vancouver where the mountains meet the coast and the winters are mild enough that outdoor rinks are a rarity. His parents, Marijan and Slavica, were Croatian immigrants who had come to Canada in search of a life they could not build at home. His father worked in a factory. His mother raised 3 boys. Hockey was not the family business. It was the neighbourhood religion. Burnaby in the 1970s was a factory for hockey talent. The minor hockey programs were competitive. The coaching was serious, and the rinks were always full. Sakic was small as a boy, not the biggest kid on the ice, not the fastest, and certainly not the loudest. But he had something that coaches noticed early and opponents noticed too late. His hands were extraordinary, not just quick, intelligent. The puck seemed to arrive at his stick blade a half second before anyone expected it, and by the time defenders reacted, the shot was already gone. He did not wind up the way other kids did. He barely seemed to move his arms at all. And yet the puck came off his blade with a velocity that seemed to violate physics. He played his junior hockey with the Swift Current Broncos of the Western Hockey League. And it was there, in a small city on the Saskatchewan prairie, that the first great tragedy of his life occurred. On December 30th, 1986, the team bus hit a patch of black ice on the Trans-Canada Highway and crashed. 4 players died: Trent Kress, Scott Kruger, Chris Mantica, and Brent Ruff. Sakic was on the bus. He survived. He was 17 years old. In the weeks and months that followed, the surviving players were asked to do something no teenager should have to do: grieve their friends and keep playing. Sakic did both. He played the rest of that season with a ferocity that those who watched him said they had never seen before. He scored. He fought. He carried a team that was held together by grief and grit. And he never, not once, publicly discussed what that crash had taken from him. Not for decades. That silence was the first sign of the man he would become, a man who carried enormous weight without ever asking anyone to notice. The Quebec Nordiques drafted him 15th overall in the 1987 draft. 15th, not 1st, not 5th, 15th. 14 teams looked at Joe Sakic and decided someone else was more important. He arrived in Quebec City for the 1988-89 season, and the team he found was a disaster. The Nordiques had finished last in the league the previous year. The arena was half empty. The franchise was bleeding money. The city, while passionate about hockey, was small, French-speaking, and far from the media centres that manufactured stardom. Playing for Quebec in the late 1980s was the hockey equivalent of performing Shakespeare in an empty theatre. The work was brilliant, but almost no one was watching. And it gets harder, because Sakic was good, obviously immediately undeniably good. He scored 23 goals as a rookie. He scored 39 the next year. By his 3rd season, he had cracked the 100-point barrier with 48 goals and 109 points. He was, by any measure, one of the best young players in the league. But the Nordiques could not win. They missed the playoffs repeatedly. They lost trades. They made baffling decisions. And Sakic, who was named captain at 22, one of the youngest captains in NHL history, was asked to lead a team that had almost nothing to give him in return. This is the part of the Sakic story that most people skip. The Quebec years, the losing years. 7 seasons in a Nordiques uniform, and in that time, Sakic won exactly 1 playoff series. 1. He scored over 500 points in that span. He was an all-star. He was statistically one of the 10 best forwards in hockey. And none of it translated to team success, because the roster around him was not good enough, and the organization above him was not stable enough, and the city itself was losing its grip on its franchise. The turning point came not on the ice, but in a boardroom. In May of 1995, the Quebec Nordiques were sold to Comsat Entertainment and relocated to Denver, Colorado. The city got a new team. The team got a new name, the Avalanche. And Joe Sakic, who had spent 7 years in hockey's quiet corner, was suddenly playing in a major American market with a new arena, new fans, and a roster that had been quietly, methodically upgraded. Peter Forsberg, the Swedish prodigy, acquired in the trade that sent Eric Lindros to Philadelphia, was entering his prime. Adam Deadmarsh was a fearless power forward. Sandis Ozolinsh anchored the blue line. And then, December of that first season in Denver, the Avalanche acquired Patrick Roy from the Montreal Canadiens in a trade that shook the sport. Roy was the most accomplished goaltender of his generation, a 2-time Stanley Cup champion, a 3-time Conn Smythe winner, a man whose competitive fury was so intense that he once got into a fight with the president of his own team. His arrival in Colorado changed everything. Suddenly, the Avalanche were not just good, they were terrifying. And at the center of it all, wearing number 19 with the same quiet authority he had carried in Quebec, was Sakic. The difference between a talented team and a championship team is leadership. Not speeches, not motivation, leadership. The kind that shows up in the third period of a tied game. When the legs are heavy and the ice is chopped up and the crowd is screaming, and one player takes the puck and says, with his body and his blade, "Follow me." That was Sakic. He did not give fiery locker room speeches. Teammates have said over and over that Sakic's pre-game talks were short, sometimes just a few words. "Let's go, we know what to do." That was it. But when the puck dropped, he played with a controlled violence that made every word unnecessary. His wrist shot, that famous, devastating wrist shot, was not just a weapon. It was a statement. It said, "I do not need to tell you I am the best player on this ice. I will show you." But here's what makes this story unforgettable. The man who had waited 7 years for a roster worthy of his talent, who had endured the indignity of losing in a half-empty arena in Quebec, who had carried the grief of a bus crash and the burden of captaincy through the worst years a franchise could offer. That man did not crumble when the pressure arrived. He rose. He rose with a quiet, chilling certainty that the 1996 playoffs would reveal to the entire hockey world. The 1996 Stanley Cup playoffs are where the legend of Joe Sakic truly begins, because this was the moment when everything he had endured was either vindicated or rendered meaningless. The Avalanche entered the postseason as the best team in the Western Conference. But in hockey, regular season dominance is a promissory note that the playoffs are not obligated to honor. The roster was loaded, Roy was in net, Forsberg was electric, but none of it mattered unless Sakic, the captain, the man who had never won when it counted, could prove that he could win when it counted. In the first round, they swept the Vancouver Canucks in 6 games. In the second round, they defeated the Chicago Blackhawks in 6. In the Western Conference Final, they met the Detroit Red Wings. And this is where the story earns its weight, because Detroit was not just a good team. Detroit was a machine. Scotty Bowman, the winningest coach in NHL history, was behind the bench. Steve Yzerman, another quiet captain with his own history of playoff heartbreak, was the leader. Sergei Fedorov, Nicholas Lidstrom, Slava Fetisov, Vladimir Konstantinov. The roster was a murderer's row of talent. The Red Wings had won 62 games that regular season, a record that stood for decades. They were supposed to win the Cup. Everyone knew it. Everyone except Colorado. The Avalanche beat Detroit in 6 games. Sakic was relentless throughout the series. He scored goals that shifted the momentum. He made plays that Yzerman, his counterpart, later admitted he could not answer. The Red Wings, for all their brilliance, could not stop the one thing that Colorado did better than anyone. They could not stop Joe Sakic's wrist shot from finding the net when the game was on the line. Set the stage. Game 3, the series tied at 1 apiece. The Avalanche on the road in Detroit, facing a hostile crowd that had been waiting since 1955 for a championship. Sakic scored the go-ahead goal in the third period on a shot that Red Wings goaltender Mike Vernon never saw. The release was so quick that the television replay had to be slowed down for the broadcast team to identify the moment the puck left the stick. Vernon, after the game, shook his head and said something to the effect of having had no chance, that by the time he reacted, the puck was already past him. Colorado advanced to the Stanley Cup final against the Florida Panthers. The Panthers were the feel-good story of that postseason, a young expansion franchise that had shocked the hockey world by reaching the final. But they were overmatched. The Avalanche swept them in 4 games, and Sakic was named the Conn Smythe Trophy winner as the most valuable player of the entire playoffs. He had scored 18 goals and added 16 assists for 34 points in 22 games. The numbers are striking, but the context is what gives them meaning. This was a man who had played 7 years without winning a single thing that mattered, and in his first real chance, he did not just win, he dominated. When the final horn sounded and the Avalanche poured onto the ice, Sakic lifted the cup for the first time. Watch the footage. He does not scream, he does not cry. He lifts it with both arms over his head, and his face carries an expression that is difficult to categorize. Not joy exactly, not relief exactly, but something closer to completion, as though a circuit that had been open for 7 years had finally closed. He had waited longer than most captains wait. He had suffered more than most captains suffer, and now the cup had his name on it. The kid from Burnaby who had survived a bus crash, who had toiled in Quebec's shadows, who had been drafted 15th because 14 teams thought someone else was better, that kid was a champion. But the story does not end in celebration. It accelerates into war. Because the Avalanche-Red Wings rivalry, which had ignited during the 1996 Western Conference Final, was about to become the most intense, violent, and personal rivalry in modern hockey history. It began with Claude Lemieux. In the 96 Conference Final, Lemieux, Colorado's agitator, a man whose talent for enraging opponents was matched only by his talent for scoring in the playoffs, hit Detroit's Chris Draper from behind into the boards. The hit was vicious. Draper's face was shattered. He required surgery to reconstruct his jaw, his cheek, and his nose. Detroit did not forget. They did not forgive. And on March 26, 1997, when the two teams met again in the regular season, the violence that had been simmering erupted. Darren McCarty attacked Lemieux. Patrick Roy and Mike Vernon fought at center ice. The benches cleared. 9 fights broke out simultaneously. It was one of the most infamous nights in NHL history, and it was the beginning of a rivalry that would define both franchises for the next half-decade. Sakic's role in the rivalry was not as a fighter. He never dropped his gloves in the brawls. He never delivered cheap shots. His role was colder, more surgical, and ultimately more devastating. He was the man who beat Detroit where it hurt most, on the scoreboard. In the 1997 playoffs, the Red Wings got their revenge, eliminating Colorado in the conference final on their way to winning the cup. But Sakic and the Avalanche came back the next year, and the year after that, and the war continued. Each playoff meeting was an event. Each game carried the weight of every hit, every brawl, every goal that had come before. And through all of it, Sakic played with the same lethal calm. He did not engage in the theatrics. He scored. He set up teammates. He competed with an intensity that opponents said was actually more unsettling than anger, because you could not rattle him. You could not make him lose control. He simply kept coming, shift after shift. That wrist shot always loaded, always ready, always dangerous. The second championship, in 2001, was the culmination of everything. The Avalanche had retooled their roster. Rob Blake, the bruising defenseman from Los Angeles, had been acquired at the trade deadline. Ray Bourque, the aging legend from Boston, had come to Colorado the previous seasons for one last chance at the Cup. The roster was deeper, the hunger was sharper, and Sakic was in the midst of the finest individual season of his career. He would win the Hart Trophy as the league's most valuable player, the Lady Byng Trophy for sportsmanship and excellence, and the Ted Lindsay Award as the player's choice for the league's best. He scored 54 goals that season, 54. At age 31, in an era of clutching, grabbing, and defensive systems designed to smother exactly the kind of player he was, Sakic put the puck in the net 54 times. The shot had not slowed, the hands had not aged, and the mind, that quiet, calculating, devastating hockey mind, was sharper than it had ever been. the playoff run was a masterclass. Colorado defeated Vancouver, Los Angeles, and St. Louis to reach the final against New Jersey. The Devils were defending champions, coached by Larry Robinson, backstopped by Martin Brodeur, the greatest goaltender of his generation, a man whose butterfly style and puck-handling ability had redefined the position. New Jersey was not going to hand the cup over. They were going to make Colorado bleed for it. And Colorado bled. The series went 7 games. There were nights when the Avalanche looked overwhelmed, when the Devils' defensive structure seemed impenetrable, when Brodeur was stopping everything. But Sakic was magnificent throughout. He scored goals. He created chances. He played through injuries that the public would not learn about until months later. In Game 6, facing elimination on the road in New Jersey, Sakic delivered one of the defining performances of his career. He scored a goal and added an assist in a 3-1 victory that forced the decisive 7th game. And in that Game 7, in Denver, with every piece of his career converging into a single night, the Avalanche won 3-1. Then came the moment. The commissioner presented the cup. Sakic took it, and instead of skating his captain's lap, he turned and handed it to Ray Bourque. The arena erupted. Bourque, a man who had played 1,826 regular season games, more than 22 full NHL seasons, without winning a championship, held the cup over his head and wept. It was not a small cry. It was the kind of weeping that comes from a place so deep that the person experiencing it seems almost surprised by its force. And Sakic, the man who made the gesture, simply stood to the side and watched. He had already won the cup before. He knew what it felt like. He wanted Bourque to feel it first. That gesture has been replayed millions of times. It has been called the single most selfless act in Stanley Cup history. But to understand it fully, you have to understand what it cost. Sakic had just played through an exhausting 7-game series. He had just won the Hart Trophy. He had just completed perhaps the greatest individual season of any forward in the 2000 era. The cup was his to claim. The lap was his to take. Every fibre of competitive instinct, every year of sacrifice, every memory of those empty arenas in Quebec, all of it entitled him to that moment. He gave it away without a second thought. And when asked about it later, he simply said that Bourque deserved it more. There is a third chapter to the Sakic story that often gets less attention, but deserves it. The 2002 Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City. Sac was named to Team Canada alongside Yzerman, Lemieux, Brodeur, and a roster of the greatest Canadian players alive. Canada had not won Olympic gold in hockey since 1952, 50 years. The pressure on that team was immense, not just to win, but to restore a nation's belief that it still owned the sport it had invented. Sakic was the best player on the ice for the entire tournament. He scored 4 goals and added 3 assists. He played with a precision and authority that made teammates look at him differently. Not as a fellow all-star, but as the best player in the world at that moment. In the gold medal game against the United States, Canada won 5-2, and Sakic's performance throughout the tournament earned him recognition as the tournament's most valuable player. But what teammates remembered most was not the goals. It was the way he played, the composure, the poise, the refusal to let the enormity of the moment alter the quality of his game. Mario Lemieux, who had seen everything the sport could offer, later said that Sakic was the most complete player he had ever shared a locker room with. Coming from a man widely considered one of the 3 or 4 greatest players in history, that is not a compliment, that is a verdict. But the body that delivered all of this was not indestructible, and the truth gets heavier. Throughout his career, Sakic played through injuries that would have sidelined lesser competitors. Knee problems plagued him in his 30s. Back issues surfaced and never fully resolved. He played seasons where every shift was a negotiation between what his mind demanded and what his body could deliver. The decline was not sudden. Sakic was never the type to collapse, but it was steady, and by 2007 and 2008, the wrist shot had lost a fraction of its speed, the skating had lost a step, and the team around him had aged past its window. Then came the lawnmower accident. In September of 2008, just weeks before training camp, Sakic severely injured his hand in an accident involving a gas-powered snowblower at his home. Several tendons in his fingers were damaged, The injury required surgery and months of rehabilitation. He missed the entire 2008 to 2009 season. For a player who was already 39 years old, the injury was widely viewed as the end. He never played another NHL game. The career of one of the most elegant players in the history of the sport ended not with a final goal or a farewell tour, but with a quiet announcement that he would not return. But away from the ice, away from the records and the rivalry and the roar of the Pepsi Center, there was a quieter story, one that the cameras rarely captured and that Joe Sakic almost never discussed. Sakic was, by every account, the most private superstar of his generation. He did not do endorsements with the hunger of his peers. He did not appear on talk shows. He did not cultivate a public persona. In an era when hockey players were beginning to understand the value of branding, Sakic treated celebrity the way he treated an opposing forecheck, as something to be avoided cleanly and efficiently. His post-game interviews were brief, measured, and almost entirely devoid of the self-promotion that the media craved. When he scored a hat-trick, he credited his linmates. When the team won, he praised the goaltender. When asked about his own performance, he deflected with the mechanical precision of a man who had been deflecting praise for his entire adult life. This was not humility as performance. This was a man who genuinely believed that the attention should be elsewhere. Teammates have spoken about this at length. Peter Forsberg, who played alongside Sakic for years and was himself one of the most talented players on the planet, once said that Sakic was the only captain he ever played for who never once raised his voice in the locker room. Not after a loss, not after a bad period, not after a game where the team had embarrassed itself. Sakic's method was different. He would simply go out the next shift and play harder, skate faster, compete with an intensity that said everything a speech could not. The message was not delivered in words. It was delivered in shifts. And the message was always the same. I am still here. Follow me. Let that sink in. A man who captained one of the most talented and volatile rosters in hockey. A roster that included Patrick Roy, whose temper was legendary, and Claude Lemieux, whose ability to antagonize was almost pathological. And he led them not with fire, but with frost, with calm, with an unwavering consistency that teammates said was more motivating than any speech they had ever heard. Because you cannot argue with a man who simply outworks you every single night. The bus crash haunted him. He carried those 4 names, Kress, Kruger, Mantica, Ruff, for the rest of his life. He rarely spoke about it publicly. When he did, it was brief and weighted. He participated in memorial events for the fallen players. He stayed in contact with their families. But the full depth of what that experience did to a 17-year-old boy, what it meant to watch your teammates die and then be told to keep playing, that was something Sakic kept in a locked room, inside himself. Those who knew him well said it shaped everything about the way he lived. The quietness, the refusal to waste time on things that did not matter, the almost fierce protectiveness he showed toward younger teammates. All of it traced back to a December night on a Saskatchewan highway when the world taught him, in the cruelest possible way, that everything can end without warning. And then there was the toll of the game itself. Sakic's hands, those beautiful, impossibly quick hands, absorbed punishment for 20 seasons. The wrist shot that defined him required extraordinary flexibility and strength in his fingers. And by the end of his career, those fingers had been broken, jammed, and reconstructed more times than he publicly acknowledged. The lawnmower accident that ended his career was, in some ways, the final insult to hands that had already given more than any reasonable body should be asked to give. When Sakic retired, he could not grip objects with the same ease he once had. The tools of his greatness had been worn down to their limits. Let that sink in. A man whose hands were the single most important physical asset in his career. The hands that released the fastest wrist shot of his era, that delivered passes with surgical precision, that held the Stanley Cup over his head twice. Those hands were permanently altered by the sport he gave his life to. He never complained about it. He never used it as material for a memoir or a sympathy campaign. He simply adapted, as he had always adapted, and moved on. The transition from player to executive revealed another dimension of the quiet captain. Sakic became the general manager of the Colorado Avalanche, and he brought the same philosophy to the front office that he had brought to the ice. Patience, precision, and a refusal to be rushed by outside noise. He rebuilt the franchise through the draft, acquiring Nathan MacKinnon, Cale Makar, and Mikko Rantanen. He made shrewd trades, he waited, and in 2022, the Avalanche won the Stanley Cup again. Sakic's third as a member of the organization, and his first as the architect rather than the player. He had built the team from the ground up, and when the moment came, he watched from the press box with the same composed expression he had worn on the ice decades earlier. The pulse, apparently, still did not rise. What do you do with a man like that? A man who scores 625 goals and deflects every compliment? A man who wins 2 cups as a player and 1 as an executive and still seems genuinely uncomfortable being called a legend? A man who, when asked what his greatest moment in hockey was, once said it was not a goal or a trophy, it was seeing his teammates succeed. There is something almost maddening about Sakic's humility, because it denies the audience the catharsis of celebration. You want to call him the greatest. He does not want to be called anything. He just wants to win and go home. Step back from the timeline. Step back from the goals and the assists and the playoff series and the rivalry with Detroit. Look at the whole thing from a distance, from the kind of distance that only time provides. And what you see is not just a career. You see a philosophy. Joe Sakic represented something that hockey, as a sport, has always claimed to value, but has rarely seen embodied so completely. The idea that the team is the point, not the individual, not the brand, not the legacy, the team. He wore the same number for his entire career. He played for one franchise, from Quebec to Colorado, and he never once publicly flirted with free agency, never once used the leverage of his talent to demand a trade to a bigger market. He stayed, he committed, and he built. The era he played in is gone now. The Avalanche-Red Wings rivalry has cooled into mutual respect. The players who fought those wars, Sakic, Yzerman, Roy, Forsberg, Fedorov, Lidstrom, have all retired, and the arenas that shook with their combat have been renovated or replaced. But the echoes remain. You can still watch the footage of Sakic handing the cup to Bourque and feel the hairs rise on your arms. You can still read the statistics and shake your head at how a man who played in the dead puck era of the late 90s scored 54 goals in a season. You can still talk to people who watched him play and hear the same phrase repeated. You had to see him live to understand, because television could not capture the speed of that release. It could not convey the way he controlled space on the ice, the way he seemed to know where the puck was going before it got there, the way he made everything look effortless in a sport that demands the opposite. Connect the opening scene to this moment. The man who handed the cup to Bourque, that was not a random act of kindness. That was the culmination of a life spent believing that greatness is measured not by what you take, but by what you give. He gave 7 years to Quebec. He gave 2 decades to Colorado. He gave his hands, his knees, his back, and his anonymity, and in return, he asked for nothing but the chance to compete. So how good was Joe Sakic actually? Here is the answer, stated plainly and stated true. He was one of the 10 greatest forwards in the history of the National Hockey League. 625 goals, 1,016 assists, 1,641 points, 2 Stanley Cups, a Hart Trophy, a Conn Smythe, an Olympic gold medal, a career plus-minus of +30. He played in 13 All-Star games. He was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 2012 in his first year of eligibility. But the statistics, impressive as they are, do not capture the man. What captured the man was the way opponents spoke about him. Steve Yzerman, who battled him for a decade, called him one of the best competitors he ever faced. Scotty Bowman, who coached against him in the fiercest rivalry of the era, said Sakic was the most dangerous player in hockey when the game was close in the third period. Martin Brodeur, who faced him in a 7-game Stanley Cup final, said the wrist shot was the hardest thing he ever tried to stop, not because of its power, but because he could never tell when it was coming. He was a man who led without noise. He was a captain who gave the cup away. He was a superstar who refused to act like one. He was a winner who carried his losses just as visibly as his victories, though you had to know where to look. The cold truth about Joe Sakic is that he was exactly the kind of player every franchise dreams of having and almost none ever gets. A player who could carry the offense, absorb the pressure, mentor the young, respect the old, and walk away when the time came without bitterness or spectacle. He played hockey the way he lived his life, with precision, with patience, and with a quiet ferocity that burned so cleanly it left no smoke. The last image is this: a man skating off the ice after his final game, not knowing it was his final game, because the injury that would end his career had not yet happened. He did not get a farewell tour. He did not get a final ovation. He simply left the way he had always done everything, without fanfare, without complaint, and without needing anyone to tell him how good he was. The names on the cup fade eventually. The silver bands fill up, and old ones are retired to the Hall of Fame. But for as long as the band from 1996 and 2001 survives, the name Joseph Sakic will be there, engraved forever, quiet and permanent, exactly the way he would have wanted it.